going to kick it off with a bit of I'm going to give you guys a 5 to 10 minute case study of how you can use technology, not in a commercial sense, as Ndade Khomesane said, but more in how you can use technology in your communities to help your communities. And I'm going to give you a case study of something we did earlier in the year. And after myself, Kojo will come up and talk about digital innovation and storytelling and owning our own stories as Africans. Earlier this year, I think we're all aware there was a xenophobic attacks in South Africa, which kicked off in Soweto with the killing of a young boy by a Somali shopkeeper. So sitting down with our team at iAfrikan, we asked ourselves, what can we do to help with this? But before I get to that, let's speak about the history and background of these xenophobic attacks and where they started. I hope you can all see the screens. If you can't, please come closer. We looked back and asked ourselves, what can we learn from the past? Is there data that shows us or patterns that we can pick up of how these attacks happened or how they played out so that we can help police? We looked back, we couldn't find any data or research data to use to pick up patterns. So in 2008, what we picked up by scraping the web, scraping is a technological term where we write programs that go out to all the major news outlets, and we capture headlines and data and distill it into a database to make it so that we can analyze it. What we picked up is that in 2008, the attacks resulted in over 60 non-South Africans being killed in townships and squatter camps. We couldn't find anything beyond that. What we also picked up, speaking to the police, which we worked with on this project, was that lots of cases were thrown out because after the attacks, people went back to their country, so there were no witnesses, etc. Then, again, there were attacks, prominent xenophobic attacks in 2009 until 2012. And this is where we started picking up certain patterns. Somali shopkeepers started being, as we picked up from news articles that we scraped, started being mentioned as the problem in townships. So articles were saying that community members were saying that Somali shopkeepers are taking their jobs, etc., etc. Got a lot of articles saying that. Fast forward to 2013, 2014, same thing. 2013, 2014 attack off in Cape Town, in Philippi, where local shopkeepers or business owners organized themselves and asked, what should we do with these Somali shopkeepers? So with that anecdotal data or that anecdotal information that we scraped using technology, we asked ourselves, what can we do in 2015 with this current situation? Same situation again in 2015. That photo was taken in Soweto. Graffiti saying, Somalis, go away from us puzzles. So again, you see 2008, 2009, but there's still no data. You can't analyze and say, wait, how do these things start? Who's being attacked? How many people, etc., etc. So we said, same old patterns, but we need to do something. So the main question with myself and the team was, what can we do? At the time, in January until April, there was a lot of rhetoric or a lot of awareness campaigns. Everywhere you went, radio, TV, magazines were talking about stop xenophobia, we are one, etc., etc. But we thought it reached a level where there was too much noise and very little action. And there was a lot of rhetoric. So we asked ourselves, what can we do? So being technologists, the first thing one of the team members asked was, maybe we should build an app. And that was like, for who? The people we're trying to help are immigrants, are foreigners, and most of them don't use smartphones. So app was out the question. But the main thing we distilled it down to was we need to help police. Why? Because these xenophobic attacks are criminal attacks, once you distill it. Attacking non-South Africans is a criminal act, therefore we need to help the police arrest these people to curb this as soon as possible. So we built a platform called reportxenophobia.iafrikan.com, which you can still see, it's still up, we still get reports. What the platform aimed to do was to help non-South Africans in South Africa who are experiencing these problems in townships, in rural areas, to report back to us, working together with the police. We're working with the National Operations Center, working together with the UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency, and our other partners on the analysis side were the Wits University's African Center for Migration and Society, who helped us distill this data and pick up patterns. So we said we're going to build this platform, and UNHCR has agents on the ground in various townships, in various rural areas, etc. So we gave them, they handed out pamphlets with the SMS number for reporting back. So the tools we used are free, which is, I'll touch onto them now, are free tools that are available, and they're all African. The first tool we used for crowdsourcing and crowd mapping is Ushahidi, which is a Kenyan tool developed in Kenya, which helps you plot incidents. Not only xenophobic incidents in our case, you can use it for plotting all sorts of things and crowd mapping all sorts of things. So we used Ushahidi, that was the first thing. We did certain modifications to it. And we also used a free tool, again Kenyan, called SMS Sync, built by the iHub team in Kenya as well. So this allowed us to have a dedicated Android tablet where people could SMS in incidents. And this linked back to our portal on Ushahidi. But we had so you can do it automatically. It can plot it automatically on the map and view it on a phone. But we had processes, because this was a very sensitive matter. So we had people who would call back once we received an SMS to try and verify. And we also worked with the UNHCR agents on the ground to try and verify certain incidents. Because at times, as I'll explain later, you get a single incident reported 10 times or more times. So it's very important to verify the data. So SMS Syncs was the other one. And we also had Twitter and email for reporting, but those were relatively useless given who we were targeting. What did we track? We tracked all sorts of categories. We tracked police activity in terms of arrests police were making and crowd control activity that they were involved in. In terms of xenophobic incidents, we tracked assault, crowds gathering to assault people, murders. And we also had a process for verifying trusted reports. And this is something I can discuss with you later because I see time's running out. And we also still, because we had already built the scripts and the technology, scraped the news, scraped the web for news articles about xenophobic incidents. And what did we gather? I mean, what did we pick up? One, Gauteng was the most violent. It experienced the most murders. But more interesting, apart from what you can read there, was that there seemed to be a link between service delivery protests, which ended up mutating into xenophobic. You couldn't pick this up unless you had the data. So every time there was a service delivery protest, a few hours later, you'd get SMSs saying, oh, my shop is being trashed, or there's a crowd gathering outside my shop. So with anecdotal data from the media, which you can't rely on, as I'll touch on later, you wouldn't pick this up. Secondly, what we picked up, the media weren't reporting on a lot of police activity. Police were doing a lot of activity. They were arresting a lot of people. They shut this down quicker than anybody. You wouldn't pick that up again through media without using technology. So we picked that up working with the police and getting all these arrest reports that the police are actually doing something. It's just that the media, I need to fast forward. It's just that the media is amplifying the negatives. So a single murder gets reported 24, 48 hours on e-news. It gets repeated for a whole week on Sowetan. But arrests, it's like a flash in the pan, and nobody talks about it. And they were doing arrests every day. That was one of the lessons we picked up. And in terms of dealing with people in townships, when you go back to your communities, forget the fancy smartphones. SMS still rules. Forget Twitter. Twitter and hashtag, I know Ms. Obenewa yesterday was talking about hashtag activism. That is good for awareness up to a certain point, but you need to do something. So in terms of communicating with people in townships, in rural areas, SMS is still number one, and WhatsApp. And also, when you use technology, especially when you use things like crowd mapping and crowdsourcing, verifying the data is very important. Thank you.
I'm going to try to use this. I'm going to share a couple of thoughts, and they really are just kind of some ill-formed, some still forming, and some hopefully well-formed, which is an extension of I think, what Tefo has talked about as well as what Victor has talked about. To give you a little context, I mean, when we talk of this idea of the African intellectual, so my father is originally from Ghana. So that's why when I heard the Kwame Nkrumah quote, there was a little smile on my face, because those are the ideals that I was brought up with. My father went to Europe as a young man, as a student. After independence, when Kwame Nkrumah and the party sent students overseas to learn the skills to come back and run a country, because Africans at that time had never run administration or run countries in that form. And I then grew up in Lesotho. So I've been in South Africa for about 14, 15 years now. My big cause in life is how do we take ownership of what the future looks like as Africans? And how do we define what that future will look like? And who will frame that conversation? So Victor was talking about the media. I'm the former editor of Destiny Man, so I don't do that anymore. But with the media, particularly in this country, what's interesting is, what I find more interesting is what's left out as opposed to what's included in a story, what's talked about, etc. And living in a very digital world, living in a technological world, we've been sold this idea that the medium is the most important thing. So the channel, the medium, whether it's the phone, the internet, it's always, that's the important thing. And I always say the geeks kind of sold us this idea and we all bought into it. I am of a different view as a writer, as a person who's naturally curious and loves kind of knowledge, is the message is the most important aspect. And the message is the story. As human beings, we have told stories for time immemorial, and it hasn't changed now. So an ad is a story. Everything is a story, and that's kind of how I view the world. And from an African perspective, from a South African perspective, what's always interesting is, we always say content is king. But for me, what's more important is context. Content may be king, but content for the sake of content is just information, it's just data that's there. And what Tefo was talking about, where they were then contextualizing the content, the data that they were getting on the xenophobic attacks, it starts to become useful when we contextualize it. And on the African continent, we are telling our stories, but a lot of times we're not contextualizing it. And I'd like to use the example of the advertising industry in this country. So if you look at an advert, and if it's targeted at black people, then it's umama dancing, kind of joking around, and to a certain extent making a caricature of a woman. If it's targeting Indian people, then it must be hot. Like it's food and it's hot. Because it's being framed from a particular perspective, it's being framed from a particular thinking. And this is where, and I think Victor talked about it, this is the important part. We need to change our thinking. We have the power, we have the knowledge, we have the capacity. That's all there. Where we're struggling with is understanding that we have it, but also changing our thinking and approaching things. So when I worked for a magazine, when you're doing an article and somebody says ethnic hair, what's ethnic hair? Because it's framed from, traditionally publications, particularly lifestyle publications, are framed from a Caucasian and a Western perspective, the other is going to be, nappy hair to a certain extent. But if your target market, if the people you're speaking to, the majority are the people with that kind of hair, then you have to quantify the Caucasian hair. And hair, the norm, becomes what was traditionally not. So it's literally just a change in thinking, in a way we frame, and we approach different things. So for me, that's the thing, is that the message and contextualizing that message is the most important aspect of it. And the medium, the channel, is merely just that. It's a channel. Getting caught up in the idea that Twitter is important. Twitter is not what's important. It's how people use Twitter. And I was having a conversation earlier. I signed up to Twitter in 2008. And I remember people used to say, you take it too seriously, man, it's just Twitter. And then people started losing jobs of the things they said. People started getting arrested. The level of bullying that takes place, and sexism, and misogyny that takes place on social media is at an amazing high. And all of a sudden, it's just Twitter. So it took people time to understand that it's not about the platform. The platform is merely a communication channel. Just like a car is a vehicle to take you from point A to point B. You could take a horse, Kimosotho. So you could take a horse, you'll still get from point A to point B. It may just take you longer. So it's, all of those things for me are just channels. The most important aspect is how you frame it, how you approach it, how you contextualize it. And you look at this continent, if we look at technology, when I was sitting there, I was saying, like, Victor's touching on everything I wanted to talk about. But just to give you some examples. So he talked about in Kenya with mobile money, which is M-Pesa. So M-Pesa has been an amazing success in Kenya, as well as in East Africa. So a lesser extent in Tanzania and Uganda. Vodacom brought M-Pesa to South Africa. M-Pesa exists in South Africa. They partnered with Nedbank. It never worked because they were trying to they brought it to solve a problem that wasn't there. We have debit cards in this country. In terms of money, there are a lot more people with things like debit cards. Whereas in Kenya, Safaricom was the dominant cell phone provider, so they can push something through. And it's a different society. So it's about finding solutions that make sense for the environment you're in. And unfortunately, look, so I believe for the South Africans in the room, I apologize, but my wife and children are South African, so I believe that it allows me to say certain things. South Africa has a superiority/inferiority complex. It has an inferiority complex when it comes to the world because it's continuously trying to measure itself against America and Europe. And an superiority complex towards the rest of the continent. And what's happened? Kenya is the technological development hub of Africa. South Africa isn't. South Africa is not on the top growing economies. Connectivity, South Africa has been dropping down the list. Ease of doing business, Rwanda is one of the biggest movers. Mauritius is up there. South Africa is dropping down because when you see yourself as above, you won't learn. And the thing to learn from the rest of the continent is very simple. We have Silicon Cape in Cape Town, which is the kind of technological hub to create apps, devices, etc., etc. They always talk about we need to create world-class apps. And I used to judge the MTN Business App of the Year Awards. And this was a big argument I used to have with people. Because you're trying to create a messaging system, you're going to compete with WeChat, WhatsApp, BBM, iMessage, etc., etc. Create solutions for problems that we have. And this is what's happening around the continent. They're contextualizing the problems and finding solutions that address the problem. So M-Pesa was addressing a Kenyan problem, which it did successfully. And so for me, this is the really important aspect of the approach. And changing our thinking, it's let's look around. Victor talked about it. What are the problems that surround us today? And how can we then use technology to solve those problems? And in some instances, there's something somebody's doing in America. It's a great foundation. How do you modify it to solve a problem? Because they are doing it. Whenever there's an election around the world, but particularly in Africa, what does Google do? They have an entire hub of information around your country, your elections. They're archiving the Nelson Mandela Center for Memory. They archived all of that. So they're coming and doing all of that stuff. And what will happen is that we'll continue to kind of just dance on the surface while others come in and take not just ownership of our resources, which has been happening forever, but take ownership of our knowledge. And when that happens, we will never, ever catch up. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kojo. Quite insightful. Just to kick off the discussion and touching on some of the things you talked about in terms of solving African problems, an example comes to mind of e-commerce in Nigeria. And I'll ask a question after the example, where as typical e-commerce, you need a credit card, and stores started popping up in Nigeria where they set up initially as requiring credit cards, and they hit a problem that, one, many people didn't have credit cards. Secondly, even if they had credit cards, Nigerian credit cards weren't accepted online widely. Secondly, the other problem was logistics. I think if you've been to Lagos, you'll know that Lagos traffic is crazy from 5 a.m. until 11 p.m. So deliveries, same-day deliveries and overnight deliveries were becoming a headache using trucks. As time went on, I think the local online stores like Jumia and Konga realized that, one, we need to do cash on delivery payments, so they innovated around that. And secondly, they used something very unique to Nigeria, which is Okadas, the motorbikes. So they started using Okadas to do same-day delivery and overnight delivery. But the question I want you to, or the statement I want you to elaborate on is, how can the alumni now go back to their communities and think like that and use technology, and how can they go about it? I know you talked about solve African problems, but what should the thinking be around that?
I think we need to be, and it sounds very vague, but we need to be naturally curious. And you need to be plugged into the environment that you exist within. So it's being able to look at, being able to identifying some of the problems that are there, but also then going kind of, because we can't solve every single problem that exists. There may be one specific one that concerns you, and I think if it concerns you, you're better placed to start to think about it. And because we're talking about thinking, I think, when I say I think, but one of the biggest challenges we have in the world today is people aren't taught how to think. We just automatically absorb. So if a newspaper says it is so, it is so. If we sit here and we'll make certain statements and it is so. Weirdly, as a child, I read a speech that Malcolm X gave in Selma. And I grew up admiring Malcolm X. And he said to a group of students, don't just take what I say, like listen to what I say and then absorb it and take it as fact because I am Malcolm X. Take it in, go home, process it, discard what doesn't work for you, absorb what works for you. And it's something that I've tried to apply to my life. So it's really about opening our eyes to what's happening around us, and identifying and getting an understanding of what the real challenges are. There's an interesting product that I just heard about. A social entrepreneur, there was a competition one of the alcohol brands did. So he's created a warning system for shacks. Because I live near Kaya Sands, and there was and it happens often in informal settlements. If there's a fire in one place, one fire engines can't get in because the roads are too narrow, and people don't know. So literally this shack burns and it happens so quickly. So he's created a warning system for shacks, which then kind of goes across. And the second aspect, I think, one of the more important aspects, especially in the world today, is finding your business model. Everything can't be NGO, everything can't be for profit. So it's about being creative with the business model. So it's applying the lessons and the things that you're learning in experiences such as this, and as well as in our professions, and really approaching the business models differently.
Okay. We open the floor for questions. Anyone?
Thank you, speakers. It was very interesting. I'm not a tech fundi by no means a form. Just the question that I have, or one is a statement, the other question. Tahrir Square was organized through social media using technology. The government eventually shut down the Wi-Fi connectivity, but by that time this message had already gone out and people formed the liberation or revolution. Was already beginning in Tahrir Square and all over Egypt, which was a useful tool, and I think it brought out because we just come from a session we were discussing programs and how we can use social media also to do what we want to do, the work that we intend doing. But I also think that there's also a danger around using social media, and I think you highlighted that, with the xenophobic attacks, which was exaggerated by the media,
True.
social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And it sent out a message that a certain group of people, isolated a certain group of people, were doing bad against South Africans. So there's that danger. So how do we guard against that danger? And how do we protect against putting out that putting the information out there? Because you also mentioned that public service strikes were linked to xenophobic attacks. So how do you know xenophobic attacks are not just pure criminal activity? So how do you draw the line, and how do you use social media responsibly or technology responsibly?
Okay, we're just going to take 2 more questions and we'll answer all of them.
Good morning, colleagues. First up, thank you, Tefo. He's a Pretoria old boy, so I'm very proud to be
Thank
listening
you.
to you today.
He's my schoolmate, by the way. Went to high school with him.
Serious nepotism. Just quickly, how do you suggest or recommend that we try and make this coming revolution, the things that we're trying to do, rely on technology as producers of technology? So I mean, most of the implementation tools, most of the media networks are all outside of this internet, and like you said, the SMS is still king. But how do we then, instead of being consumers of energy and trying to revolutionize Africa, how do we become more and more producers of the media space, of the data itself, like you just did, show it as an example now? How would you then externalize your experience to influence us as guys who are trying to make those changes, to be able to use media and technology as not as consumers, but actually as producers of data and of technology as well?
Okay, I think we'll answer these 2 and take 2 more. Do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll start with, so the first question, in terms of Tahrir Square, yes, they did use platforms. But for me, it goes back to what I was saying about, it was, the platforms were a tool. So people wanted to organize, and in terms of saying, let's meet at a particular place, there are different ways we can do it. At the time, a lot of conversation was about how great Twitter is. So Twitter is inspiring a revolution. And I am of the view that Twitter did not inspire the revolution. It was merely just a tool that people used. So Twitter is not important. It's not the important thing. What was important, just like in London, they used BBM. So when they had the riots in London a couple of years ago, they used solely BBM. In terms of using platforms responsibly, I'm now saying this earlier on, like I use social media, I use digital platforms. I've always been interested in those things. And I think it's great that it gives people voice. But perhaps slightly controversially, I also believe that not everybody should have voice because of how it's used. And, I don't think there's a quick fix to it. Like I mentioned, I remember in the beginning, and I'd have friends say to me, you take things too seriously. It's like, it's just words. Like, it's only Twitter. And there's so many stories now of people whose lives have been absolutely altered because of things they said on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. So it's a growing thing of how do we, particularly with the kind of generations who are growing up with these platforms where they can just speak. It's kind of how do we start to teach them. And I think what for me has been very interesting, particularly in South Africa in the last couple of months, is that with the students, you're seeing them start to recognize that they can use their voices for more than just talking rubbish on social media and talking about entertainment and gossip, etc. So I think, it's an ongoing thing, and I think it's important that we constantly reinforce it, to go, listen, these platforms are great, but you have to use it responsibly to a certain extent. I don't know if you have
Thanks for
anything
that.
to say on that.
We're running out of time, so I'll answer this question. In terms of how do you externalize what I was talking about, or how do you implement this in your own areas? I'll use your particular example because I know you're in the health space. So the first thing could be in terms of data. I mean, you probably see a lot of patients and you pick up certain patterns, but without documenting those, without capturing those, you won't pick up, you'll have anecdotal data. So the first thing is maybe start with that. In terms of, probably the next question you'd ask is where can one learn to code? You don't really need to learn to code, and I'd like to emphasize what Kojo just said earlier. It's more about thinking and critical thinking, so looking at your space that you work in individually and saying, what is the problem here? And thinking like from a problem perspective and saying, what is the problem and who is it affecting and how can I solve that? Before you even think about technology. I know it's counterintuitive coming from a technologist, but rather start thinking about the problem, how you can solve it, and who you're targeting with it. And you might find that the solution is not technology. You might find that the solution is more improving processes, and technology plays a small role. So I'd rather you take a few steps back in terms of thinking about technology. Yes, there are tools that can help you, but start a few steps back and think, what are the problems? How can we address them? And see where technology is more a tool, it's not going to solve your problems. It's more going to facilitate solving of problems.
So I would like to quickly add, there are so many things out there. So it's also about just kind of equipping yourself. So for example, Samsung puts in solar-powered health clinics into areas, as well as classrooms. And there's so many different people doing things like that. So it might be a matter of identifying one that you feel would work in your area. And if it needs to be localized or modified, identifying people who have that skill. Because you're coming from a particular skills base. So if you're talking about health, you're coming from a particular skills base and you understand the struggles, identifying and kind of equipping yourself. Because there's so much information out there and there's so many people out there doing interesting things across this continent.
And just to wrap up, we've run out of time. Technology is there to complement the things you do, as I've said briefly. Technology will never replace human thinking, will never replace humans. So you need to be critical thinkers, I think, as alumni. And as I said, think about what problems you can solve and see what technological tools can do to complement what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I saw there were a number of hands, but for those who couldn't ask questions because of time, I'm sure the guys are still around for a few minutes. Kojo, are you good? Okay. They're still around for a few minutes, so you can just take it offline.